In an era when African leaders are often molded by foreign interests, one young man stands apart. A soldier-turned-statesman, a symbol of defiance, a voice for a continent long silenced. A pause. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and today he is becoming Africa's most influential young leader, the youngest president on the continent. At just 34 years old, Traoré became not only the leader of Burkina Faso, but a shocking new political force in a continent tired of old systems and recycled politics. Some saw him as an anomaly. Others saw him as a danger. But millions, especially Africa's youth, saw him as a mirror. A symbol of what Africa could be if courage replaced compromise. His rise wasn't planned. It wasn't polished. It wasn't endorsed by Western media. It came from the streets, from the frustration, from the suffocating grip of insecurity and economic stagnation. When Traoré stepped forward, he didn't step into power. He stepped into responsibility. And that became the foundation of his influence. A different kind of leader. What made Traoré different wasn't just his age. It was his attitude, his tone, his clarity. While many African leaders spent decades giving speeches about sovereignty, Traoré acted on it, fast, decisively, unapologetically. He cut ties with countries exploiting Africa. He rejected IMF pressure. He chased out foreign military forces that failed to deliver results. He aligned with neighbors, not with neocolonial powers. He spoke openly, directly, without coded diplomacy. And suddenly, Africa had a leader who wasn't afraid to speak the truth. Not afraid to confront global powers. Not afraid to defend his people. He became a leader the youth could relate to. Not because he was young, but because he was real. The moment that changed everything. The world began to notice Traoré the day he said words that echoed across the continent. Our land will no longer be a playground for foreign armies. We will defend it ourselves. Those 17 words sparked a revolution, not of violence but of confidence. Millions across Africa replayed the clips. Students shared them. Activists repeated them. Journalists quoted them reluctantly. Western officials whispered about them nervously. In a single moment, Traoré became what many leaders fear becoming. A man with nothing to lose and everything to defend. The new symbol of African sovereignty. Traoré became the embodiment of a rising African consciousness, a new refusal to kneel, a new era of straight spines and strong voices. For decades, Africa had seen leaders chosen, guided, or influenced by foreign governments. But Traoré, he wasn't shaped in Paris. He wasn't polished in Washington. He wasn't trained for diplomacy in Geneva. He was forged in the heat of Burkina Faso's struggle. He was molded by the reality of insecurity. He was shaped by the failures of foreign assistance. That gave him something rare. Authenticity. People trusted him because he came from the trenches, literally. He wasn't a man reading speeches from air-conditioned offices. He was a man who once rode through forests hunting down terrorists with his unit. That grounded him. That humbled him. That hardened him. And Africa felt it. The reason young Africans connect with him. What makes Traoré's influence explode across the continent isn't ideology, it's relatability. Young Africans see him and say, he looks like us. He talks like us. He thinks like us. He fights for something real. He doesn't bow to anyone. He represents a generation tired of broken promises, corruption, foreign interference, endless poverty, puppet governments, leaders who rule for 40 years while doing nothing. Traoré doesn't represent the past. He represents the future. A future where African pride is not just spoken, but lived. The regional alliances that changed West Africa. One of the biggest reasons Traoré is becoming so influential is simple. He didn't isolate himself. He unified. He built the Sahel military alliance with Mali and Niger, an alliance that shook West Africa's political landscape. He moved from individual strength to collective power. This alliance wasn't symbolic. It was practical, strategic, and revolutionary. Together they expelled foreign troops, rejected ECOWAS pressure, formed a joint military command, launched shared economic programs, unified against terrorism, proposed a new Sahel currency, challenged France's resource monopoly. This wasn't just diplomacy. This was nation building on a regional scale. For the first time in decades, African countries were watching African leaders cooperate without waiting for Western approval. That is influence. That is power. The West begins to feel threatened. The more Traoré spoke, the more Africa listened. The more Africa listened, the more the West worried. Because for the first time, a young African leader wasn't afraid to call out misinformation, challenge exploitative mining deals, reject debt traps, question Western military failures, expose media manipulation, and openly accuse foreign powers of destabilizing Africa. He broke the unspoken rules. He said the quiet part out loud. And that made him dangerous, not to Africa, but to those who benefited from Africa's weakness. The beginning of an African renaissance. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré is not an isolated event. It is the spark of something bigger. A continental awakening. A return of African confidence. A generational shift. His journey, starting from soldier to national leader to regional symbol, shows African youth that leadership doesn't need age, wealth, or privilege. It needs courage. And that is why he is becoming Africa's most influential young leader. Not because he seeks power, but because he inspires it. Influence is not given. It is earned moment by moment through choices that shape destinies. And that is exactly how Traoré built his influence, decision by decision, each one echoing far beyond Burkina Faso. His influence didn't explode overnight. It grew every time he refused to compromise Africa's dignity. It gained power every time he rejected pressures from abroad. It expanded whenever he spoke raw truth in a world addicted to diplomatic lies. One of the turning points came during a meeting with a Western delegation. They arrived with polished speeches, carefully crafted agreements, and hidden conditions. Their language was elegant, layered, rehearsed, but Traoré didn't come to perform. He came to protect. When they tried to explain why foreign forces needed to remain in Burkina Faso indefinitely, Traoré listened without interrupting. And then he delivered a single sentence that shocked the entire room. If you could not defeat terrorism in 10 years, why should we believe you'll do it in 20? Silence. A silence that traveled across Africa. A silence that exposed what many leaders were too afraid to say. That moment became a symbol of his leadership. Straightforward, fearless, unfiltered. And millions of young Africans replayed the clip, sharing it as if they had said it themselves. Because in a way, Traoré spoke for them. He spoke for the farmers whose land had become war zones. He spoke for the mothers who lost their children. He spoke for the youth who felt trapped between corruption and unemployment. He spoke for nations tired of dependence disguised as assistance. He became the voice they were waiting for. His influence spread not through propaganda, but through authenticity. not through power but through principle. But influence alone is never enough to change a continent. Traoré needed allies, and he chose them carefully. His first major alliance was with Mali and Niger, forming the now famous African Trio, a united front of young leaders bonded not by politics, but by shared struggle. It was a bold step, especially in a region shaped for decades by foreign influence. The moment the alliance was announced, the world paused. Analysts rushed to news panels. Western capitals called emergency meetings. African citizens celebrated in the streets. Because this alliance wasn't symbolic. It was a declaration. Africa will stand together. Africa will protect itself. Africa will decide its own future. With this alliance, Traoré didn't just gain partners. He gained a movement. The Sahel began a shift. Policies changed. Borders strengthened. Resources were reclaimed. Foreign troops lost their unquestioned authority. Regional identity awakened. But Traoré's influence wasn't only political. It was cultural. It was psychological. It was spiritual. For decades, Africa had been told that unity was impossible, that sovereignty was unrealistic, that independence required permission. But when Traoré stood before massive crowds and spoke with fire in his voice, young Africans felt something they had never felt before. Pride, possibility, power. He didn't speak from a place of superiority. He spoke from a place of brotherhood. He addressed the youth directly. He spoke their language. He understood their frustrations. He respected their potential. And in a continent where youth are often ignored, underestimated, or silenced, this felt revolutionary. In cities from Lagos to Kampala, from Dakar to Nairobi, murals of Traoré appeared on walls. Students quoted him in debates. Activists invoked his words during protests. African diaspora communities held events discussing his speeches. It wasn't just admiration. It was identification. Because while older African leaders spoke about liberation in the past tense, Traoré spoke about liberation in the present tense. He did not talk about what Africa had been or what Africa lost. He talked about what Africa could become. He talked about future industries, future currencies, future alliances. He talked about ending exploitation, not managing it. He talked about building national armies that could stand without foreign supervision. He talked about transforming Africa into a continent that dictates its own destiny. But influence attracts enemies. It wasn't long before coordinated media attacks began. Western editorial boards published articles portraying Traoré as dangerous, radical, even delusional. But these attacks didn't weaken his influence. They strengthened it. Because every negative headline proved exactly what Africans already knew. That powerful nations fear African leaders who think for themselves. And Traoré embraced the criticism. "Let them fear us," he once said during a speech. "Fear means they can no longer control us." Those words spread like wildfire across social media, transforming from a quote into a movement. Young Africans printed them on shirts, wrote them on posters, tweeted them millions of times. It became a symbol of a new mentality. Africa will no longer apologize for wanting dignity. By this point, Traoré's influence wasn't just national. It wasn't just regional. It was continental. His speeches were analyzed in universities. His policies were studied by economists. His philosophy was dissected by political scientists. His presence shaped discussions in African parliaments. His name appeared in youth-led petitions, demanding reforms in other countries. For the first time in a long time, Africa's most influential leader wasn't the oldest, richest, or longest-serving. He was the youngest. the one with the least political history, the one with the strongest convictions. But the world had only seen the beginning. Because Traoré wasn't just influencing Africa through words or alliances. He was about to influence Africa through transformation. And it would change everything. Influence becomes unstoppable when it turns into action. And that is exactly what happened next. Traoré didn't want to be remembered as just another loud voice, another revolutionary who inspired speeches but failed to change reality. No, his mission was bigger. His goal was not applause but transformation, not popularity but sovereignty. So he began rebuilding Burkina Faso from the ground up. The first battlefield he entered was the economy. For decades, the country's gold, cotton, and minerals enriched everyone except the people. Contracts were written in foreign capitals. Profits vanished into foreign banks. Local industries suffocated under unfair trade deals. Traoré confronted this system head-on. At one meeting with foreign company executives, men in expensive suits, armed with decades of dominance, Traoré simply placed a single document on the table. A revised mining contract. One that redirected the majority of profits to Burkina Faso. One that eliminated loopholes. One that stopped tax evasion. One that ensured local employment. One that ended a 40-year cycle of exploitation. The executives protested. Some threatened to withdraw investment. Others warned of economic instability. Traoré leaned forward and said softly, "Burkina Faso existed before your companies. It will exist after them." And that was it. A line drawn. A new era declared. When the new contract was publicly announced, crowds filled the streets in celebration. For the first time in years, citizens felt the state was fighting for them, not selling them out. This economic shift began to ripple across Africa. Young activists in Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania started calling for similar reforms. Lawyers studied Burkina Faso's new contract models. Ministers in neighboring countries requested copies. Economists wrote papers titled the Traoré Doctrine, a template for African resource sovereignty. His influence was no longer philosophical. It was structural, concrete, practical. But Traoré was not done. The next institution he targeted was education. He understood something many leaders ignored. If Africa wants sovereignty, Africa must educate its youth for sovereignty. Not for dependency. Not for migration. Not for foreign validation. So Traoré pushed for the creation of new technical schools, agricultural academies, defense training centers, and innovation labs. He introduced programs that taught real skills: engineering, construction, cybersecurity, renewable energy, local manufacturing. In a speech to students, he declared, "Africa has the youngest population in the world. If we train this generation correctly, we will not need to beg anyone for development." Young people cheered as if he had unlocked a secret, because deep down they knew he was right. Africa's greatest wealth isn't in gold or oil, it's in its youth. Traoré treated the youth not as followers, but as partners. Not as a demographic, but as a force. Not as a burden, but as the future. And that, more than anything, made him influential. But nations are not built only with dreams, they are built with security. Burkina Faso was surrounded by threats: insurgents, traffickers, foreign mercenaries, political sabotage networks. But instead of outsourcing security to foreign powers, Traoré made another bold decision: build an African army for Africa. He invested in training camps, expanded equipment production, recruited thousands of new soldiers, and developed joint missions with Mali and Niger. He emphasized discipline, patriotism, and unity over salary and hierarchy. A documentary team once captured a moment in a training camp. A commander told Traoré, "Sir, the soldiers say they don't fight for money anymore. They fight because you fight with them." Traoré smiled slightly and replied, "A leader who stands far away cannot inspire courage." This line became legendary. Videos of him visiting frontlines, eating with soldiers, walking through dusty villages without heavy protection, sitting with grieving families. All of this spread across Africa like wildfire. People saw a leader who didn't hide, a leader who wasn't afraid, a leader who lived among his people, not above them. And that image, raw, human, authentic, transformed him into something rare. A leader who looked like the future. But with every success, global pressure intensified. Diplomats complained. Intelligence agencies monitored him. International journalists repeated familiar narratives. Think tanks warned that Traoré's ideology threatens Western interests. He responded calmly, "If our sovereignty threatens your interests, that means your interests were built on our loss." That sentence traveled across the world in minutes. Young Africans cheered. Western governments winced. Political analysts scrambled to respond. At that moment, Traoré wasn't just influencing Africa. He was intimidating the establishment. Because they understood something they had not expected. Traoré wasn't trying to restore the Africa of the past. He was building an Africa they had never imagined. An Africa that controlled its borders. An Africa that negotiated on equal footing. An Africa that rejected manipulation. An Africa that defended its land. An Africa that trusted itself. This terrified those who benefited from African weakness. But it inspired millions who dreamed of African strength. Traoré's influence spread further when he began redefining diplomacy. He didn't travel with large delegations. He didn't attend every international conference. He refused symbolic appearances. He avoided photo op politics. Instead, he visited countries based on purpose, not tradition. When he traveled to Mali, young people lined the streets. When he visited Russia, the meetings made headlines. When he spoke to Chinese engineers, they listened respectfully. When he met with Niger's leaders, they walked like brothers. African unity, once dismissed as a myth, began to look possible again. And throughout this rise, something extraordinary happened. Even Africans who disagreed with Traoré's methods respected his conviction. Even critics acknowledged his courage. Even elders admired his discipline. Even opposition groups recognized his integrity. Because influence does not require universal praise. It requires undeniable impact. And Traoré's impact was everywhere. In political speeches, in street conversations, in youth activism, in academic research, in military reforms, in continental alliances, in global debates. His influence became a mirror, reflecting what Africa could become if more leaders prioritized sovereignty over comfort, unity over division, people over politics. But the world was about to witness the clearest proof of his influence yet. A moment that would shake Western capitals. A moment that would electrify African youth. A moment that would turn Traoré from a leader into a symbol. And it was coming faster than anyone expected. A leader becomes influential not when the world follows him, but when the world can no longer ignore him. And that is where Ibrahim Traoré now stands. The final chapter of his rise began quietly, without applause, without ceremonies, without fanfare. It started with a simple announcement from the Burkina Faso government. The era of foreign dominance is over. Burkina Faso will build its own future. Those words triggered a reaction that shocked even the most experienced diplomats. In European capitals, emergency meetings were held. In Washington, analysts produced long reports overnight. In Paris, media outlets scrambled to create narratives. In African cities, young people celebrated in the streets because a new energy was spreading across the continent, a belief that sovereignty was not just a dream, but a choice. Traoré had turned that choice into a national mission. The defining moment came when Burkina Faso officially joined a new security alliance with Mali and Niger. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't diplomatic theater. It was historic. Three nations, breaking away from decades of dependency, united under one principle. Africa will protect Africa. When the alliance was announced, global powers expected the usual African hesitation, division, or compromise. Instead, they saw confidence, unity, conviction. At the public ceremony, Traoré walked to the podium, raised the alliance flag, and addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across West Africa. No foreign army will defend our land better than our own sons and daughters. The applause lasted several minutes. But what happened afterward was even more shocking. Thousands of young volunteers, farmers, students, mechanics, teachers, signed up to join defense forces. They didn't come for money. They came because they believed in this new vision. They came because a leader had convinced them they were worth defending. And that feeling of dignity, of agency, of reclaiming destiny, began transforming not just Burkina Faso, but the entire region. Traoré's influence grew beyond politics. In universities, students debated his ideas. In markets, vendors spoke of him with pride. In villages, elders prayed for his safety. On social media, young Africans called him a symbol of hope. Even in countries where leaders feared his message, the youth quietly admired him. This was not manufactured popularity. This was not PR. This was not propaganda. It was resonance. Because Traoré spoke the language Africa had been waiting to hear for decades. The language of self-belief. The language of dignity. The language of freedom. But every revolution faces resistance. As Traoré's influence grew, so did the pushback from outside. International media published articles calling him too young, too radical, too defiant. Think tanks labeled his policies dangerous. Foreign governments used diplomatic pressure, economic warnings, and behind-the-scenes negotiations to soften his stance. But Traoré didn't flinch. He simply replied, "If defending my country makes me radical, then we need more radicals in Africa." That line spread like fire. Even African leaders who rarely commented began acknowledging privately that Traoré had forced the world to address Africa differently. He had broken a pattern long accepted as unbreakable. The pattern where African leaders bowed first. The pattern where African interests came last. The pattern where African strength stayed hidden. And now, in the halls of global power, the question was, who is Traoré? It had become, how much more influence will he gain? That influence grew even stronger when Burkina Faso announced a major shift in economic strategy, an ambitious plan to stop exporting raw materials cheaply and start refining them inside the country. Gold refineries, textile plants, energy infrastructure, agricultural hubs. This was something foreign investors feared, because it meant Africa keeping value inside Africa. During a televised meeting, Traoré said, "Raw materials make others rich. Finished products make nations rich. Africa must join the second group." Economic analysts called this the most disruptive idea in modern African policy. But for the youth, it felt natural. They finally saw a leader who didn't want them to flee their countries to succeed. A leader who wanted their countries to succeed so they wouldn't need to flee. And that is why influence followed him like a shadow. Because influence is not about age, not about position, not about speeches. Influence is about alignment between a leader and the dreams of his people. And Traoré aligned perfectly with a new African mindset. Bold, unapologetic, fearless. The final wave of influence came during a meeting that captured global attention. Representatives from multiple African nations gathered to discuss a continental economic zone free from external political pressure. Some came with doubts, others with caution, a few with quiet skepticism. Traoré entered the room and spoke without notes. Africa does not need permission to unite. We only need courage. Silence fell. Some ministers leaned back. Others folded their arms. But within minutes, nodding began. And by the end of that meeting, a new initiative was born, one that aimed to reduce reliance on Western financial systems, strengthen intra-African trade, and create a collective development strategy. Journalists later wrote that Traoré tipped the balance. No, he didn't tip it. He pushed it confidently forward. Because influence is not passive. It is intentional. And Traoré's intention was clear. An Africa that negotiates, not pleads. An Africa that defends, not waits. An Africa that builds, not borrows. An Africa that leads, not follows. This vision made him the most influential young leader on the continent. Not because the world approved, but because Africa believed. And belief is the foundation of every revolution. The narrator's voice lowers, preparing for the final line. Ibrahim Traoré's rise is not the story of one man. It is the story of a continent remembering its power. A pause. Then the last powerful invitation. If you want more stories that reveal the truth behind Africa's new era, its leaders, its victories, its awakening, make sure to subscribe. Because the revolution is just beginning.